Hi guys, so for the 200th episode of my review series, I decided to take a break from my ongoing review cycles and do something a little bit unique and special as a one-off, and The Shining is absolutely that, at least in the eyes of the wider horror community. I personally have never been a massive fan of it, albeit I'd only previously seen it once coming into this rewatch, and that was a long time ago. So this promised to be a fascinating exercise as far as I was concerned, a chance to see, after all these years, would I finally become a fan of The Shining? I know why I didn't like it when I was a teenager, because back then I was into films with big body counts, you know, Halloween's, your Friday the 13th. The idea of me watching a psychological thriller about three people banged up in a hotel, that just wouldn't have cut the mustard for me back in the 90s. So I forgot about this film for a long time. And then just randomly, when I was in my 30s, I read the novel by Stephen King, and I thought it was a brilliant book, so well written. It would have been one of King's early ones as well, probably written back when he was still in his 20s. It's a really great piece of work, I can't emphasise that enough. And once I was finished with that, I think the seeds were firmly planted that I was going to give The Shining, the film version, another chance at some point. And we finally arrived at that moment. So if you don't know the story about this film, it's about a small family, a husband, wife, and a son, a small boy of about 10, I'd say, and they go to stay in this hotel deep in the Colorado mountains. Is it called the Rocky Mountains? This particular hotel is so isolated, it's only open 6 months of the year. The other 6 months, in deep winter, it has to shut. The blizzards cover the roads, no one can get to it. But they still need a night watchman, somebody to stay there during those 6 months of downtime to keep the boilers running, do any repairs that need doing. So Jack Torrance gets the job for this particular year, and he takes his family with him. But when they get there, they start to suffer cabin fever, especially this lead character, Jack Torrance. And it turns out a lot of people who have stayed at the hotel over the years have had psychological episodes. This hotel has a bit of a sordid history, so that's the setup. It's a great setup. The film was directed by Stanley Kubrick. I've still never seen any other film by Kubrick other than The Shining. He wasn't the most prolific of directors. I looked at his filmography the other day. There's lots of gaps between his films. I know he's quite famous for doing A Clockwork Orange. My brother's seen that, I've not. It's just not something that I'm particularly interested in seeing. One film of his I would like to see is 2001: A Space Odyssey. I'm really into sci-fi and film set in space, so that is absolutely going to happen at some point. I will get around to that. And I guess the last thing to say about The Shining before we jump into reviewing it is the fact that I was watching the director's cut for this. I didn't know that there was a new version for this film. So theatrically, I think that they released like a 2-hour version or close to 2 hours, and in later years on home release they've had this extended cut that's like 140 minutes, 145 minutes. I laughed a little bit when I realised that, because of all the horror films in the world that you would think there might be scope for an extra 25 minutes in the story, The Shining would surely be one of the last ones on the list you would pick for that. I mean, you know, the premise of this, it's impressive that King managed to drag it out for a 400 or 500 page novel, and he did so with aplomb. It's a brilliant book, as I've said, but yeah, I didn't like the film back when I first saw it. So when I realised that this was going to be that film, but with 20-25 minutes extra, I was a little bit nervous about that, but I shouldn't have been, because I can tell you now that I enjoyed this film a lot more the second time around. It's a really good film, and let's dive into some of the pros and cons. This movie, by the way, gave me goose flesh twice in the first 5 minutes for reasons that I'm pretty sure Kubrick didn't even intend. So the very first shot of the movie sees a camera flying over this small island of shrubbery and small trees that's in the middle of a lake. But my brain was confused as to what it was seeing at first, because I thought this little island was coming towards the camera really fast as well. And I thought to myself, whoa, what the hell is this? Is there something on the island? Is this a dream sequence or something? And it was a little bit freaky. And then I realised that no, the island itself is not moving. The camera is just going over the top of it. But it was a weird thing for me to be confronted with within like literally 3 seconds of the movie starting. And then the second thing that I found unsettling was this job interview that Jack Torrance goes on with a character called Ullman. Now, I absolutely suck at interviews in real life. I'm pretty sure that I've missed out sometimes on really good jobs because I've not been very good at interviews. It's just something I've never been able to master. And I totally was able to feel Jack Torrance's discomfort when he goes on this interview with Ullman. It feels like we're watching the entire interview, not just the highlights. So we don't just get to see the questions Ullman's asking that are relevant to the job. We also get to see those bullshit questions that they just throw in there because they want to fill out the time that's been allocated. And Jack Torrance is just sat there kind of like grinning and like, yeah, and all the time probably thinking, please end this interview because I've done really well, and sooner or later, if this carries on, we'll get to a question that I mess up and I'll have undone all of my good work. So yeah, watching that entire interview play out really did bring back some memories to me. But once we get past these two incidental moments right at the start of the film, once we get to the main action, which I'd say starts about half an hour into it, because it takes that long to get Wendy and Jack at the hotel and to get everybody else out of there. Once we get into the main thrust of The Shining, I don't think it's a massively scary film. And it's a good one, don't get me wrong, but I think films that have come along since The Shining, things like The Conjuring, Insidious, Sinister, have done this sort of thing a lot better. Even a film like The Amityville Horror, which came out around about the same time as The Shining, I think is a scarier movie than this. But as a drama, as a thriller, it's still very, very effective. And I certainly was never bored throughout these 2 hour, 20 minutes, 2.5 hour runtime. It is literally like an Oscar-winning film, but with a horror sort of flavour to it at times. The script is very, very well written. There are lots of really long dialogue scenes that you don't normally get in horror films. I like it when writers are brave enough to let a scene go on for quite a long time because they have the confidence in their dialogue to just let characters sit there and talk for quite a bit of time and to just assume that the audience isn't going to get bored. And there are lots of scenes like that in the first half of The Shining, especially. The interview between Ullman and Torrance is a case in point. My two favourite scenes in this by far are when Jack goes to the bar, forget what it's called, the Gold Room or something, and he starts chatting to this imaginary friend called Lloyd. Well, it's not an imaginary friend, it's probably just a ghost of the hotel, but these scenes were an absolute delight to me. The second time he goes into this bar, I think the whole place is filled with ghosts of past revelers at the hotel. I thought to myself, have they really just dressed out like 200 extras in tuxedos just for this 20 seconds of film? It doesn't look like CGI. And then we get this great scene where Jack goes into the toilets and we meet Grady, and it's at that moment of the film where we realise that there's actually an entity in this hotel, really, which has a personality and a conscience and is plotting to get Jack to kill his family. I thought that was one of the creepiest scenes in the film, the one between Grady and Torrance. I think if there's one thing missing from the movie version that was in the book, it's a sense of the hotel's history. We don't really get any of that, apart from one little story that Ullman gives about some caretaker that went crazy back in the day. But in the novel, Jack goes down to the basement at one point and he finds all these boxes full of papers and clippings from old newspapers, and it turns out the hotel has a really bloody history going back like 200 years, all these different things that have happened over time. And Jack Torrance absorbs all this in a really long reading session, and it's quite creepy because you know that this is weighing heavily on him when the next scenes come into play. And I think throughout the story, the novel version of the story, all this history is sort of slowly getting into him and affecting the way he is. In the film, we don't really get that. It's just, he turns up at the hotel and the place is making him go crazy almost instantly. Now, some people would say, well, it's scarier if you don't know why he's doing this. But the thing is, we do. It's the hotel. He's fine before he gets there. Once he settles in, he goes crazy because of the hotel. It's not a mystery or anything. So I think that would be my biggest negative on the movie version, the fact that we don't get all this whole history of the hotel being part of the plot. I don't know how you would have incorporated all that. It's not like you can have Jack just sat there with his clippings and we're watching him read all this stuff. So I don't know. I know that Stephen King wasn't a fan of the movie version to begin with. I don't know if he's changed his stance in recent years, but certainly when the film came out, he wasn't a fan of it. I can imagine that part of the reason for that is because it came out in 1980 and King was very young at that point. Maybe he didn't have that much experience of adaptations when Kubrick did The Shining, but I think it's quite faithful to the novel for the most part. I'm pointing out one thing there that isn't, but for the most part, I think they have adapted the novel as much as they could. I think that one or two things they had to change. You can't just make a movie the same as a novel. You know, some things just don't work visually. You have to sort of chop and change it a little bit. And plus, maybe Kubrick didn't want people to come into this knowing everything that was going to happen. He's especially sort of messed around a little bit with the last sort of 20, 30 minutes and how that plays out. But as someone who has read both novel and movie, I think the movie, it's not a scary horror film, but it does a really good job of adapting a complicated novel and meeting the challenges of that. I think one of the main reasons this film is not particularly scary is because it's so brightly lit. It feels like all of the light bulbs in the hotel are turned on permanently. There's no darkness, no shadows. When I try and picture this film, but it's dark and we don't know where Jack is half the time, that could have been something. But as it is, I mean, you've got scenes where Danny's going on his tricycle down these corridors, and every time he turns a corner, the lights are always turned on, even though people have possibly not been to this part of the hotel in days. He goes into a hedge maze at 3 o'clock in the morning, and it's all lit. Why at this time of night? Every corner he goes around, there's another light bulb. I don't think Stanley Kubrick had a horror brain particularly. I do like other parts of his direction. I lost count of the amount of times where a scene would begin and my first thought would be, wow, I like where he's put the camera in this scene. He's really framed everything really nicely. I can see everything that's going on. I like it. Going back to Danny on his tricycle, there's so many scenes like that where the camera just seems to glide to certain places. I enjoyed all that stuff as well. The location they had for this is amazing. I mean, this hotel looks stunningly, spectacularly beautiful. I loved the garishly coloured carpets. The ceilings, which are completely out of sight. It's just wonderful. The performances are great as well. Jack Nicholson is something else in this film. I mean, he just revels in every line of dialogue. He's got this cynical sarcasm, which is just so enjoyable to watch, even though you know he's turning into a really evil being. And I've got to praise the ending as well. I like how realistic it feels. If you're a mother and son in this situation with a much stronger person, this is a realistic way that you could take him out potentially, lead him into a maze, and then he just kind of dies of hypothermia. But it's very rare you would see this type of ending in any film, because you know what would happen in most films in this situation? Torrance would make it out of the maze and there'd be one final fight, you know, and he'd get the better of Wendy. He'd get her down on the ground or something. He'd be about to kill her, and then he'd come out with one last quip or stupid sentence like, I guess we're going to hell together. And then Danny would save the day by putting some scissors into the back of Jack's neck or something, and he'd look really confused and then he'd look back at Danny as if, how could you do that? And then he'd die. How many times have we seen an ending like that in a horror film or a thriller? It just gets boring after a time. So I really appreciated what they did with this. And it's not like having Jack die in the middle of the maze it's got a lack of drama to it. I mean, there's lots of tension with having Danny turn all these corners and you don't know if he's going to bump into this guy, and he's having to do that clever trick with the footsteps. Quite similar in the book, I think, except it was done more in the hotel, and I think Wendy and Danny had to sort of escape the hotel and leave Danny to go down with it like a sinking ship. But yeah, I did enjoy the ending of this, and I would have appreciated an extra minute or two for an epilogue just to see Danny and Wendy get rescued or something, or go back home. Although I guess, having said that, the final shot of Jack in the maze, frozen, had a sort of satisfying black comedy thrill to it, you know. Time to show you the version of the film I've got. I've got this on Blu-ray. Here it is. It's one of those that comes with a DVD as well. And some decent features, an audio commentary by Garrett Brown and John Baxter. It's also got a documentary done by Vivian Kubrick. Was that his wife? I've not checked that out yet. I did try and watch some of the commentary, but I put it on just after I'd watched the movie. Maybe that was a tad ambitious. I think this is such a rich film, a long film, that trying to dip into the features straight after you've watched the movie, maybe not the best of ideas. So I think I got about half an hour through the commentary. I'll have to see if I can finish that off this weekend. So yeah, one or two other things on there as well that I'll need to check out. And I presume that it's only the long version with this, and I'm not sure if it has the shorter theatrical cut on it as well. If, by the way, you're very familiar with both versions and there's some reason why I should watch the theatrical rather than the longer cut, then do let me know. And I suspect that most fans of this do watch the longer version. Right, it's time to get to the bag of terror and find out what sort of score I'm going to give this film. One, two, three. 3.5 bloody axes out of 5. I guess that might disappoint some of the really, really devoted fans of this film. I do like it now more than I used to. I think if I'd have rated this back when I was a teen, I probably would have given it maybe 2. So it has improved for me. I think the novel is maybe a 4.5 out of 5. I really like this film. I do respect it. There's lots of things that it does really, really well. I do think it's probably more of a thriller though than horror, and there are thrillers I like better than this. You know, I think if you take out the scene with the blood flooding the corridor, and if you take out the scene with Jack hugging the dead naked woman, I think it is a thriller really. So I do really like the film. I am going to keep it. Maybe I will watch it again at some point in the future. It's not destined to become one of my all-time favourites, but it also so close, I think. So there we have it. Right, that's all for today. Hope you enjoyed my review of The Shining, and I'll be back with episode 201 very, very soon. Until next time, cheerio.